The frost had crept past the windowsill, but Harlan Creed hadn't moved from his chair in hours. The house groaned beneath the weight of wind, its bones aching in the silence. Out beyond the warped window pane, the snow came down in long, slanted sheets, covering the land with a quiet that seemed older than Scripture. The light from the oil lamp sputtered gently against the draft. Harlan Creed sat still, wrapped in the dim glow, hands resting idle on the arms of his rocking chair. The fire in the hearth had turned to glowing coals, and he hadn't stirred to feed it. Not yet. The coffee in his tin mug was long cold, and the enamel chipped in 3 places. He always ran a finger along the edge before each sip, though he couldn't remember why anymore. He could hear the faint sound of snow kissing the roof, soft and unrelenting, like a hymn hummed by the land itself. He'd come to expect nothing new. Not since Eliza had passed in the spring of 1879, beneath the cottonwood that still stood, bare and unblooming, like it had taken to mourning with him. 2 winters had passed since, and in all that time the ranch had gone untouched by change. Harlan's world had shrunk to simple acts. Feed the mare, split the wood, heat the coffee. No chickens now, no sermons, no company. The barn still stood, because it was stubborn, like him. He let out a breath and watched it vanish in the lamplight. Then he heard it, a sound not born of wood or wind or snow, a dull thud, then a groan, low and long, like the earth itself had shifted in pain. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The rifle came from the wall with a practiced hand, but he carried it more for comfort than conviction. With the other hand, he took the lantern, shielding the flame with his fingers as he stepped into the cold. Outside, the night sky pressed low and dark, stars veiled by the falling snow. His boots cracked through the frost as he crossed the yard, each step a careful declaration. The barn loomed ahead, its slanted roof sagging under the weight of winter. Snow had gathered in mounds along the eaves. He slid the door aside, hinges groaning like something waking from a long sleep. The lantern's circle of light swept across hay and shadow, wood and rust, and then it caught the shape of something that didn't belong. There, near the ladder to the loft, huddled in a heap, were 7 children pressed tight together around a woman slumped against a post. She wasn't dead. He saw the breath flutter on her lips, but her skin was pale and slick with fever. Blood darkened the sleeve of her dress. The children didn't move, didn't cry out, just watched. One girl, maybe 12, with dark braids and eyes too old for her face, met his gaze. She didn't flinch. "Please don't," she said. Nothing else. No begging, no panic. Just that. Harlan stood frozen, the rifle slack in his hand, the lantern trembling ever so slightly. It was like something out of a half-remembered parable. Dust and cold, tattered skirts, children piled like kittens around a dying mother. The snow slipped through a gap in the roof, dusting the woman's shoulders like a final indignity. Her feet were bare. Without a word, Harlan shrugged off his coat and stepped forward, draping it over her. The youngest boy whimpered, a soft hiccuping sound that broke like a dam inside him. "Shh," the braid-haired girl whispered, her hand stroking the boy's hair. Harlan knelt slowly beside the woman and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. Fever. High, but not yet fatal. "There's a fire in the house," he said quietly, his voice thick from disuse. "It's warmer there." No one moved. He stood, turned, and walked back into the snow. Didn't wait. Didn't look back. Inside the house, he stoked the fire high and brought the kettle to boil. From the back pantry, he took what little was left of the apple preserve Eliza had made the autumn before she died, spread it thick on hard bread. The stew was too thin, but hot. Then he waited. They came not as a herd, but as a slow, silent procession, one child at a time. Lena came first, dragging the woman's feet across the threshold like she was hauling something sacred. Harlan did not help, not out of cruelty, but because he understood what dignity costs when offered in pity. The youngest curled near the hearth, asleep before warmth touched his skin. The others followed, quiet, watchful. The woman was placed on Harlan's cot. He stood by the door, hat in hand, the fire crackling between them like a line that none dared cross. "Who are you?" he asked. The braid-haired girl shrugged. "Hungry?" He nodded once. "I've got stew. Not much, but hot." Another boy, freckled and sharp-eyed, studied him like a coyote would a snare. "You gonna make us work for it?" "No." "Call the sheriff?" "No." Lena watched him long, like she was weighing his soul against her weariness. Then we'll eat." They did, silent, quick, bowls scraped clean. It wasn't until the fire had dimmed and most of the children had fallen into sleep huddles that the woman stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, wild and rimmed with pain. She sat up too fast, clutching the quilt. "The barn." "You were freezing," Harlan said gently. "Didn't know it was your land." "Still is," he replied. "Doesn't matter." She looked around, counted the children with shaking hands. Her voice cracked. "They followed me. You were leading." She blinked at him, then at the fire. "We won't stay long." "You will tonight." She said nothing, only nodded. Later, after the fire had settled and the room grown still, Harlan moved among them like a ghost. He draped the quilt tighter over sleeping shoulders, tucked a sock back onto a child's bare foot, let his rifle remain untouched above the mantel. Outside, the coyotes howled into the distance, but the house was still. He did not sleep. At first light, he moved toward the barn for morning chores. The mare whinnied low as he passed. Near the beam where he'd found them, Harlan spotted the real culprit. A part of the roof had collapsed, rotted through. The cold had made it worse. Snow had piled in. "Best patch it quick," he murmured. And he did, before breakfast, the sound of his hammer ringing out over the silent land. By the time he returned, the woman was upright, limping but steady, spooning broth into the mouth of the youngest boy. She did not look up. "Thank you," she said, voice low. Harlan nodded. "What's your name?" She hesitated, like speaking it might summon something terrible. "Marta." He waited. She gestured to the children. "Some are kin. Some just stuck with me." Lena, sitting in the corner, offered a dry smile. "We're lighter than loneliness." Harlan felt something move inside him. Not pity, not desire. Recognition. He poured hot water and added lemon peel from a dried jar. Handed it to Marta. "I'm Harlan Creed. You're welcome here?" "Till the storm passes." She took the cup. Their fingers did not touch. Lena, ever watching, narrowed her eyes. "We've heard men say things like that before." Harlan met her gaze. "Then I reckon you'll know soon enough if I mean it." She nodded slowly. Not trust, but maybe truce. By noon, Marta was scrubbing the floor with rags she'd stitched from torn fabric. The children played with wood-carved animals Harlan hadn't touched in years. He didn't join them, just watched from the porch, his coffee going cold in his hand. Something in the house had changed. And as he stood there, listening to the low giggles, the scuffle of tiny boots across pine floorboards, the slow crackle of a fire tended not by habit, but by hope, Harlan Creed realized that maybe, just maybe, the house wasn't empty anymore. It felt like a story beginning. The next morning, Harlan notices one of the children has set out his boots beside his own, 2 sizes too big, as if preparing to walk in them. By dawn, the wind had quieted, but Harlan Creed's house was louder than it had been in years, not with voices, but with breath, shifting weight, and the scrape of tiny feet. The sun hadn't yet broken through the silver clouds when Harlan opened his eyes, not from sleep, but from the kind of stillness that sometimes passed for rest in men who had learned to live without dreams. A faint hush of breath, light, staggered, and layered, rose from the floorboards. The children were everywhere, curled under quilts and coats, some tangled together like vines, others sprawled in whatever corners had felt safest. The hearth still breathed embers. The scent of last night's stew lingered, thinned now by the cold. Harlan moved slow, stepping over elbows and knees, avoiding squeaks in the floor, and made his way to the stove. He fed it with kindling and bark, coaxed it back to life with a steady hand. Outside, the wind had stilled, not gone, just resting, and the snow, though deep, had softened into layers that glittered faintly under a bruised sky. Somewhere far off, a hawk screeched across Copper Ridge, and the sound broke against the valley like a cracked bell. He glanced down. One of the children had placed his own boots, mud-caked and split at the seams, neatly beside Harlan's, as if trying them on for size without slipping a toe in. He said nothing, just watched them for a moment before putting the coffee on. Marta rose an hour later. Not from the cot, she had given it up after waking, but from beside the hearth where she had sat all night, her back to the wall, a blanket wrapped tight around her like armor. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, her dress rumpled, the right hem torn clean through and hastily pinned with what looked like a bent nail. She didn't speak, just fetched a pan and began scraping soot from it with the side of a spoon. When Harlan handed her a ladle and pointed to the lard tin, she nodded once. It wasn't cooperation. It was shared necessity. Lena watched from the table, her elbows braced like a gunslinger's, her eyes darting from Harlan to Marta and back again. She wasn't just watching. She was measuring how close his hands got to her mother's shoulders, how often he looked at the door, how quickly he moved when one of the younger children coughed in their sleep. Harlan set plates out with a deliberate slowness. "There's eggs," he said. "Not fresh, but powdered." "No need," Marta replied, her voice low but steady. "Cornmeal will do." "You'll need more than that." "We'll manage." He studied her face, drawn but not defeated. That morning light showed the truth of her, dark circles beneath her eyes, 2 fingers still wrapped in a frayed cloth, a faint bruise beneath her left ear. But her chin remained high. She never flinched. After breakfast, she took to the hearth, scrubbing soot from between the bricks with a cloth so thin it barely held together. Her knuckles turned raw. Harlan brought in a bucket from the well and set it down beside her. She didn't thank him, but she used it. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly. "I do." "Why?" "Because this place don't feel borrowed when it's clean." He didn't argue, just nodded and stepped outside, letting the screen door creak behind him. The porch boards sagged beneath his boots. He stood there a while, watching the snow settle in hollows, the tracks of boots and bare feet slowly vanishing beneath the pale sun. By midday, the children had begun to move more freely. The littlest one toddled across the room with a carved horse clenched in his fist, a toy Harlan hadn't seen in years, tucked away in a box beneath the stairs. Another boy was at the window, breathing fog onto the pane and tracing stars with his finger. Marta hadn't rested. She'd sewn the hem of her dress with mismatched thread, folded bedding into neat stacks, cleaned the basin with sand and vinegar. Lena hadn't said a word since breakfast. The first sound from town came that afternoon, a distant clatter of hooves on frozen dirt, followed by a sharp call from a crow that seemed to answer it. Harlan squinted across the valley, spotting only a plume of dust trailing toward the direction of Abandon Hollow. He felt it before he heard it, how news, like dust, always traveled faster than wind. He went to the barn to check on the roof patch. The snow had melted around it, dripping onto a cracked plank that would need replacing come spring. He lingered longer than needed, just for the silence. When he returned, Lena was waiting on the porch, sitting on the top step, arms folded. "We won't be your burden," she said. "You're not. You will be, to the town. They've forgotten about me. They're starting to remember." He leaned against the post. "Miss Winslow, I suppose. Woman in a green shawl. Watched us from behind her curtains. Looked like she wanted to scrub her porch after we passed." "Miss Winslow," he repeated, smiling dryly. "She's wrong," Lena said, "about what we are." "I know." The girl looked at him, really looked. "Why haven't you asked?" "Asked what?" "Who we are. Where we came from. Would it change anything?" Lena didn't answer. Just looked out toward the field where snow still gathered like ghosts over old furrows. Then, "My mama's not weak. She just got tired of bleeding for people who don't say thank you." "I believe that. I'm watching you. I know." Inside, Jed, the freckled boy, was watching Marta stir the soup. He sniffed the air and scowled. "Ain't there no salt here neither?" Marta turned her head slowly. "Don't complain." Harlan entered then and set a tin on the table. "There's salt. I just forgot." Jed crossed his arms. "You forget a lot. I remember what matters." Silence followed, thick but not heavy. Marta stared into the pot for a long while, ladle unmoving. Then she carried it to the basin and poured the rest of the soup down, her hands trembling. That night, Harlan found her kneeling beside the hearth again, scrubbing the brick so hard that her bandaged hand left faint smears of red. "You'll bleed," he said gently. "Already am." He set down the bucket he'd carried in. "Let it rest. If I rest, it'll all come back." "What?" "The noise." He didn't press. He just sat beside her in silence until she finally stopped scrubbing. The wind outside had picked up again, whispering beneath the eaves like an old friend asking to be let in. The next morning brought stillness. Not peace, just the space between storms. Harlan rode into town for flour and nails. At the general store, he felt eyes follow him. The banker's wife stared at his boots. The blacksmith's daughter whispered into her palm. Pastor Elias nodded at him without a word. He returned with a sack of feed and a bar of soap. Marta was on the porch, mending a boot with a needle that glinted each time the sun hit it. "There was a woman in town," she said without looking up. "Miss Winslow." She turned her face when I passed. He sat beside her. "Miss Winslow thinks God watches through curtains." Marta gave a faint, breathless laugh. "She's wrong. God watches through eyes like yours. Quiet men who let strangers sleep under their roofs." He said nothing. A long silence followed, broken only by the scrape of thread against leather. Then Marta spoke, not as a question, but a statement. "I'll leave when the snow melts." He nodded once, though something in him recoiled at the thought. "You'll want to marry again," she added. "I already did," he said. "She's in the ground." The thread snapped in her fingers. Inside, one of the children began to sing, low, wordless, a sound like wind brushing tall grass. The name Mama floated through it, then vanished. Marta blinked hard and stood. Boots fixed. He let her go. That night, Harlan placed extra blankets near the fire. The cot remained hers. The children slept like birds in a nest, limbs over limbs, heads tucked into hollows. He lay with his back to the door, staring at the darkened ceiling. Something had shifted, not in the land, in him. As Harlan watches Marta fold the same quilt twice in a row, he realizes she's not cleaning, she's calming herself, and he doesn't know how long that calm will last. Laughter wasn't supposed to survive winter, but it had, thin and surprised, as if it had wandered into the wrong place and decided to stay a while. A faint wind moved through the rafters of the barn that morning, not enough to rattle the boards, just enough to stir the dust that clung to the nails and loft beams. The snow had softened overnight. It no longer cut the skin or blinded the eyes. Now it just layered everything with a hush, like the world had been paused beneath a white sheet. And within that quiet, the sound of laughter rose. It wasn't loud, it wasn't constant, but it was real. Harlan stood outside the barn, axe balanced against his shoulder, boots firm in the snow. He paused mid-swing and turned his head slightly, listening. The sound came again, muffled giggles, childish whispers, a clink of metal. He followed it, rounding the side of the barn and stopping short at the sight of a makeshift lantern swinging from a length of twine. A rusted tin can had been punched through with tiny holes in the shape of stars. Inside, a stub of candle flickered faintly. Jed grinned from ear to ear, holding it up like a treasure. "See? Told you it lights up if you catch the fire right." Lena, crouched in the snow, gave a small shrug. "It don't take silver to make a star." Harlan nodded once. "Where'd you learn that?" She didn't look at him. Somebody who didn't stay long. He didn't ask more. The wind carried away the question before it was born. Inside the barn, Marta sat on a wooden stool with the same dress she'd worn since the day they arrived draped across her lap. The hem had split further, torn jagged from where it had caught on something. He guessed a nail or a stray hook. Her fingers moved with slow patience, threading a dull needle through the fabric. Her eyes stayed on the rip, her jaw set tight. There was no joy in the act, just muscle memory. Harlan leaned against the post, watching quietly. "That the only dress you got?" She didn't look up. "It's the only one I didn't leave behind on purpose." Silence sat between them for a time, but it wasn't heavy, just still. "What happened before the barn?" he asked. His voice was quiet, low, like a horse's breath before a storm. Marta's hand paused mid-stitch. She stared at the cloth. "You don't have to say," he added, not moving. "But I'd rather hear it from you than from town gossip." Her shoulders lifted, barely. "My sister's husband wanted me gone," she said. "Said mouths like mine emptied pantries after the drought hit. Said I brought bad luck, after their baby died. He blamed me for that, too. Called me cursed." She ran her thumb along the edge of the thread. The movement slow, methodical. "The children. Some were already with me. Others joined as we moved. Word gets around. Who's got an open wagon bed? Who'll share crusts? Who won't raise a hand?" She blinked once. "I tried to keep us moving, but snow came early. So did fever. When the littlest got sick, I carried him 2 days. Thought maybe I'd find a church, or a fence with a dog that didn't bark." Harlan stepped forward, crouched beside her. "You walked 2 days carrying him?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the stitch. "Didn't seem like 2. Just seemed like, till I couldn't anymore." His gaze dropped to the dress. "That stitch is crooked." Marta gave a dry, tired laugh. "I wasn't raised to mend. I was raised to smile pretty and take orders. Looks to me like you unlearned that part." She finally looked up. There was no moisture in her eyes, but something shimmered in the way she blinked. An exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "You don't have to fix everything all at once," Harlan said. "Sometimes it's enough just to sit still and breathe." She looked down. "I don't remember the last time I breathed without fear in my throat." He stood and offered his hand. "Let's take a walk." They walked the fence line in silence. The snow had begun to melt in the slanted light of late morning, revealing bits of earth beneath the ice, dead grass, old fence posts, the edge of a buried rope. Marta limped, favoring her right foot. But she didn't complain. At the far edge of the pasture, a hawk circled above Copper Ridge, wings casting long shadows. "There's a stillness out here," she said, squinting into the pale light. Harlan nodded. That's why I stayed. After Eliza passed, it was the only thing that didn't ask anything from me. I don't think I ever had stillness, Marta said. Even as a girl, I was always making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's plans. You don't seem small now. I'm not. I just don't know what to do with all this space yet. That evening, the children helped with supper. They'd learned the rhythm of the place, who fetched wood, who stirred the pot, who kept the fire. Jed lifted the smallest boy onto a stool and whispered something in his ear that made him laugh, loud and unguarded. Harlan stood at the threshold of the kitchen, arms crossed. They're yours, he said softly. Some of them, Marta replied. All of them when it matters. That's the best kind of family. After the meal, as Harlan dried the tin bowls with a clean cloth, there was a knock at the door. He opened it slowly to find Miss Thelma Winslow standing on the porch, wrapped in a gray shawl and self-importance. Her face held the expression of someone who'd come to inspect, not visit. I brought a basket, she said stiffly. Bread, dried pears, soap. Harlan raised a brow. That so? I'm not blind to suffering, she added. Even if you've chosen to fill your house with it. Behind him, Marta stepped into view, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was calm, unreadable. Miss Winslow narrowed her eyes. Well, I suppose you're not the harlot the town's making you out to be. No, ma'am, Marta said. Just a woman who got tired of being used and left to starve. Miss Winslow blinked, taken aback by the flatness of her reply. I'll leave the basket by the rail, she said. I expect to see those children in church this Sunday. Even the ones who don't know how to sit still, Marta asked. Miss Winslow's mouth twitched. Especially those. When she left, Marta stared at the basket like it might bite. Is that what forgiveness feels like? She asked. No, Harlan said, closing the door. That's what shame disguised as generosity looks like. She looked at him. You don't think people can change? I think they change slow, if you're lucky. The fire dimmed. The house hushed. The children gathered near the hearth. Marta lingered by the window, her patched dress draped over the chair. Harlan approached, something blue and folded in his hand. I found this, he said. It was Eliza's. She used to wear it when she planted beans. Marta unfolded the dress slowly. The fabric was soft, faded, but clean, blue with faint white embroidery along the collar. I can't take this, she whispered. I'm not asking you to, he replied. Just offering. She looked at him, unsure. Why? She asked. Because I don't like seeing someone beautiful in something that hurts her. The room stilled. Marta touched the dress, pressed it to her cheek for a moment, then held it to her chest. The next morning, she wore it. The children noticed first. You look like a picture book lady, the youngest declared. Lena smiled and reached into her satchel, pulling out a string of pressed tin stars. We made you something, she said. Marta took the necklace in both hands. It's beautiful. It's not silver, Lena added shyly. No, Marta replied. It's better. She turned to Harlan, her eyes glassed with something close to peace. Thank you, she said. He nodded but didn't speak. As they walked the fence line, a hawk circles the ridge. Marta pauses and whispers, He'll find us. Men like him always do. The wind shifted before the sun did, carrying the scent of dust and danger down the slope, like it had a memory to deliver. The morning came with a silence that didn't belong to peace. It wasn't the hush of sleeping children or the lull of thawing snow. It was heavier, as if the air itself were waiting. The sky hung low, pale but not soft, its edges smudged with copper where the sun was trying to rise. Even the trees beyond the fence stood stiff, unmoving, like they sensed something coming up the ridge. Harlan Creed stood with one hand resting on the porch post, the other gripping a tin pail half full of feed. He hadn't moved since he stepped out. The mare in the paddock stamped her hooves once and let out a breath like steam, her ears flicking toward the horizon. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the hush of snow slipping from a barn roof. Hoofbeats, steady, intentional. 3 horses, maybe 4, riding hard but not fast. Like they weren't in a hurry to arrive, just determined to be seen. Inside, the children were still shaking sleep from their limbs. Jed had been chasing Lena through the kitchen with a ragged scarf. Marta was by the hearth, her hands dusted with flour, rolling out dough with a jar wrapped in cloth. When the mare gave a low warning, she froze. The change in her face was immediate. Color drained from her cheeks, her eyes turned hollow. She moved to the window like a shadow and peered through the pane. She didn't speak, but Harlan didn't need her to. He followed her gaze. A man had come down the slope, saddle high, shoulders rolled back like the world owed him room to swagger. 2 more riders flanked him, thin-lipped men in wool coats crusted with road dust. Their horses looked tired, their boots heavy. The man in front pulled his mount to a halt in the yard, like he owned it. Marta stepped out of the barn's open door, slowly. The flour still clung to her apron, her sleeves pushed up, but her hands hung at her sides like they'd gone numb. Behind her, the children peeked through the cracks in the wall. Harlan's voice was calm, but low. "Get inside." "They won't hurt me," Marta whispered. "That's not the point." She turned, gathered the children with a single look, and ushered them inside. Lena lingered, her face like a flint, ready to spark. Before Marta gently tugged her back. The man dismounted with a grunt. He didn't tie his reins. Just let them drop. His boots crunched across the frost. "Well," he said, eyeing Harlan. "Ain't you the stray collector?" Harlan didn't respond. His hand rested near his belt. Not near the rifle, not yet, but close enough to be a thought. "You the one feeding my brother's property?" "I don't feed property," Harlan said. "Just people." The man laughed. A loud, rasping sound. He smelled of tobacco and something sour beneath it. "She ain't people," he said. "She's a curse dressed up in grace, always pretending to be righteous, running off with what ain't hers." "She walked away," Harlan said. The man's grin faltered. "Did she now?" "She brought life," Harlan continued, voice still steady. "You brought filth." That word struck like a slap. The man stepped closer. His hand dropped to the polished steel at his hip. "Say that again." "I said," Harlan replied, stepping forward so that only inches separated them. "She brought life." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The man's fingers tensed around the handle of his pistol. From the shadows of the barn, the 2 other men began to fan out, one toward the fence line, the other flanking wide, circling. Harlan didn't move. He kept his eyes locked. "Touch that gun," he said, "and I'll bury you with it." For a moment, time stilled. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Then the front door creaked open again. Pastor Elias Tannock stepped into the yard, his coat buttoned, his hat tucked under one arm, a worn Bible under the other. He looked more like a man headed for supper than for a standoff. The preacher walked up the path, slow, not hurrying, not hesitating. His boots left deep impressions in the snow. "Gentlemen," he said, voice warm, almost casual. The rider, Corwin Slade, though his name hadn't yet been spoken, snorted. "Didn't come for a sermon." "Then you came to the wrong house," Elias replied. Corwin glanced sideways, calculating. "This about God?" "No, this is about decency. I came for what's owed." The preacher's gaze hardened. "And you think screaming in front of children, pistol cocked, makes you right?" Corwin shifted on his heels. "She ran. She don't get to pretend she's innocent." "Innocence isn't the question," Elias said softly. "But the Lord watches how a man handles power." Harlan took one step closer. "Your time's up." Corwin's hand twitched near his holster. One of his men flinched. Then came the sound. Boots, small ones, light, barely scuffing the wooden threshold. One by one, the children stepped out of the house. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They just stood. First Jed, then the littlest boy, wrapped in an oversized coat, then the twins, holding hands. Lena emerged last, standing beside Harlan like a second shadow. Her chin was high, her braid tight. Corwin blinked. "What's this supposed to mean?" Pastor Elias stepped forward. "It means they've chosen." "You want to make orphans out of them?" Harlan asked, his tone low but steady. "Go ahead and try." "I want to make them a home." Corwin stared at him, then at Marta, standing just behind the children. He spat into the snow. "You'll regret this," he said. Harlan didn't move. "I've lived with worse regrets." Corwin mounted his horse, the animal shifting nervously beneath him. "You're soft," he said. "That's what she saw in you." Marta spoke then, voice clear and strong. "No, he's kind. Something you wouldn't recognize." Corwin glared at her. "Last chance. Come with me, and I'll forget the rest." Marta met his stare. "I already did." He sneered, turned the horse sharply, and rode off. The others followed, their hooves carving deep scars into the snow. Dust rose in their wake, dry, bitter, swirling like a curse. The silence after was thick, not with fear, but release. The children stood still. Then slowly, one by one, they turned and walked back into the house. All but Marta. She remained on the porch, arms limp at her sides, her breath coming short and quick. Harlan walked to her, placed a steady hand on her shoulder. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. "He used to beat his brother," she said. "When I stopped it, they both turned on me." Harlan nodded. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," she said. "I'm free now." He looked into her face. "Yes, you are." She met his eyes. "Why didn't you draw?" "Because I didn't need to." A breath of laughter slipped from her lips, half broken, half holy. "You're not what I expected." "You either." They stood together, not speaking, as the sun dipped behind Copper Ridge, casting gold light over the frost-laced land. The wind shifted again, this time softer, and the trees swayed like they, too, had been waiting to exhale. That night, after the stew and the quiet, Marta pulls a piece of torn cloth from her pocket and says, "I think it's time we buried this." They didn't speak much that night, but silence, when shared between two people who've walked through storms, can feel like music. The embers in the hearth were burning low, glowing soft beneath a bed of ash, casting the parlor in the kind of light that reveals what fire alone cannot. Weariness, peace, things hard-earned. The stewpot had been scrubbed clean and set upside down to dry. The children were tucked into blankets stitched together from the scraps of others' lives, their breathing soft, unbroken. Harlan Creed sat beside the fire, legs stretched out before him, arms draped over his knees. Marta was across from him, a tin cup cradled between her palms. She hadn't taken a sip in minutes. The broth had gone cold, but she didn't seem to mind. Her fingers just rested there, wrapped around the metal as though the act of holding it was what mattered. The air smelled of flour and pine smoke. The quiet was whole. After a while, Harlan stirred, rubbing at the old ache in his shoulder. He looked up and met her eyes. No words passed between them. There was no need. She looked at the fire, then back to him, then down again. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the whisper of kindling catching flame. "If you asked me to stay," she said, "I wouldn't run." The confession hovered in the air like steam above a morning kettle. Harlan didn't answer with words. He reached across the space between them and laid his hand gently over hers, just for a moment. Then he let go. The stillness that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. The next morning, frost glazed the porch railings, and the sun rose slow over the ridge, casting long amber fingers through the cottonwood's bare branches. Harlan stepped out to the pump, filled 2 buckets, and carried them in with his usual quiet precision. Marta was already up. She stood near the window, barefoot, wrapped in Harlan's old coat. Her breath fogged the glass as she stared toward the horizon. "You'll catch a cough," he said softly. She turned to him, not startled. "I wanted to see the day start," she said. "I've never done that without dread in my belly." He set the buckets down near the stove and walked over, a pair of boots slung over one shoulder. "Figured you might need these." She looked at them, then at him. "Do you believe in second names?" He frowned gently. "How do you mean?" "A name you earn, not the one you're given. A name the world doesn't mock." Harlan nodded. "Some folks get called widow or bastard their whole lives, even when they outgrow it. I want to outgrow mine." "You already have." They didn't speak again until the sun had fully risen. That afternoon, a figure approached from the bend in the road, an old mule trotting with deliberate calm, reins held by a familiar hand. Pastor Elias Tannock rode easy, a rolled-up vestment robe strapped to the back of his saddle, and a parcel wrapped in linen tied to his side. Harlan opened the gate before he reached it. "Didn't send for you," he said. Elias nodded. "Didn't wait for you to." The preacher dismounted with a groan and patted the mule's neck. "Word travels faster than dust in this county." He looked at the barn, the laundry line strung with children's clothes, the porch swept clean. He didn't ask questions. He just took a seat on the steps and said, "Seems like you've got yourself a congregation." Marta appeared behind the screen door. "Only sermon we've heard lately is the wind. I can work with that." An hour later, folks began to arrive. No letter had gone out. No bell had been rung. But somehow they came. Not in their Sunday best, not with flowers or song, but with bread wrapped in cloth, with heads bowed, with lips pressed together like they weren't sure what they were walking into. Miss Thelma Winslow brought a loaf of cornbread and a prayer book held like a shield. She didn't meet Marta's eyes. Jed opened the barn doors wide, and the children lit the tin star lanterns, hanging them from the hayloft beams. Candles were placed atop stacked crates, their flames flickering like soft defiance. The children wore their best, patched but clean. The twins had wildflowers tucked into their collars. Lena held a bouquet trembling just slightly in her hands. Harlan stood at the far end of the barn in his old wedding coat. The wool had faded, but the creases still remembered the shape of his shoulders. He had washed it the night before and brushed off the dust. It still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. Marta walked forward slowly, her feet bare, the hem of Eliza's blue dress brushing the straw-strewn floor. The neckline had been stitched tighter, the waist drawn in, but it fit, not just her body, but her spirit. Elias stood between them, not with a lectern or book, but with hands folded before him and eyes that had seen too many unspoken prayers. "Some vows come dressed in lace," he murmured. "And some come from the silence between breaths, when one soul recognizes another as shelter." The children formed a half-circle around them. The youngest sneezed. Laughter stirred. Not loud, just real. Harlan took Marta's hands in his, and they spoke nothing. Their eyes held the rest. When Elias finally said, "You are home," no one clapped. No one cheered, but no one left either. Even Miss Winslow found herself offering the cornbread to Jed, who took it with both hands and said, "Thank you, ma'am." like the world hadn't once turned its back on them. As dusk settled and the barn dimmed, Marta sat on the porch rail, her feet swinging slightly above the step. The dress still clung to her with the scent of candle smoke and wildflowers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the same piece of cloth she'd sewn and resewn so many times before. A tattered hem, once soaked in fear, now just a memory of what she'd carried. Harlan joined her, knees creaking as he sat beside her. "I kept this," she said, holding it out, "to remind me where I started." He took it, turned it slowly in his palm. "Then let's bury it," he said. She looked over, surprised. "Under the cottonwood," he added. "Same place I buried Eliza. Not to forget. Just to begin again." Marta nodded once, slowly. "I'd like that." That night, after the stew and the quiet, Marta pulls a piece of torn cloth from her pocket and says, "I think it's time we buried this." The sky hadn't yet warmed, but the land had stopped trembling, as if even the ground had decided to exhale. At first light, the frost on the windows held steady, but the wind no longer threatened to crawl beneath the door. The hush that hung over Creed's Hollow that morning wasn't the weight of fear or the lull between storms. It was something deeper, a quiet drawn not from the world holding its breath, but from the world finally letting go of one. Harlan stood barefoot by the hearth, rubbing warmth into his palms as the fire began to stir back to life. He stared toward the barn, where the tin stars still swung faintly in the cold. The echoes of the night before hadn't quite faded. Soft laughter, candlelight shadows across hay bales, the feel of Marta's hand in his beneath the makeshift altar of memory and mended cloth. After the last of the guests had gone, after the dishes were dried and tucked away, they'd sat in the stillness of the porch until their bones ached. And even then, they hadn't wanted to move. She had sat close, closer than habit allowed, and when her head finally leaned into his shoulder, it wasn't a confession, it was a homecoming. This morning, the house held that silence still. The children were strewn across the living room floor like petals blown from a tree, limbs askew, mouths open in deep sleep, the quilt spread wide enough to cover 7 stories at once. Lena had curled against her youngest sister, her braid undone in sleep, her face soft for once. Jed had one arm across a pillow he'd long claimed as his own. The twins were nose to nose, breathing in tandem. Marta wasn't there. Harlan stepped quietly onto the porch, boots forgotten for the moment, letting the chill bite at his heels. There by the well, wrapped in his coat, stood his wife. His wife. The word hadn't yet settled in him, not because it was strange, but because it fit too well, like boots long worn and found again after a long winter. Marta's bare feet pressed into the frost-stiffened grass. She didn't shiver. Her breath came slow. Her hands were folded beneath the coat's collar as though clutching the warmth that had nothing to do with weather. "You'll freeze," Harlan said softly as he stepped onto the grass, boots in one hand. She turned her head. "I won't. Not today." He walked to her and held the boots out. She didn't take them right away. "Do you think the world will remember us?" she asked. He looked at her face, open and unguarded beneath the dawn. "No," he said, "but the children will." She nodded. "That's enough." They walked together across the field, through patches of thawing snow and long dead grass. The cottonwood stood ahead, tall and still unblooming, but its trunk was wide and welcoming. Beneath it, the earth had softened just enough. Harlan held the small bundle she'd handed him, the torn hem of the old dress, the crooked stitch still visible, the edge stained faintly with soot from the first night. He hadn't wrapped it in cloth or tied it with string. They'd agreed it should be buried as it was, plain, worn, honest. They dug a shallow hole near the roots. Marta crouched down, one hand pressed to the earth as if asking permission. No prayer, she asked. Harlan shook his head. No need. She laid the cloth in the dirt and covered it slowly. The sound of soil brushing fabric was quieter than tears, but heavier. When they stood again, she leaned against him, not for support, but in recognition. I never thought peace would feel like this, she said. Like my lungs got more room than they used to. That's what peace is, he answered. Room to breathe. The rest of the day unfolded without urgency. The children stirred and ate the last of the dried pears from the preacher's basket. Jed and Lena argued softly over who got to sweep the porch. One of the twins traced her name in the melting frost on the barn wall. The other tried to catch it before it vanished. Miss Winslow arrived near midday. She didn't step onto the porch, just left a jar of plum jam wrapped in linen and turned back down the path without a word. The only acknowledgement was a slight nod of her head. Not apology, not approval, just a small lowering of the mask. Marta watched her go through the window and didn't speak. Later, Harlan found her kneeling by the hearth, not scrubbing or sweeping or sewing, just sitting, a cup of tea untouched beside her. She held the blue dress in her lap, not to mend it, but simply to touch it. The candle nearby flickered, casting light through the lace at the collar, making it glow like something sacred. He didn't disturb her, just knelt behind her and placed a hand on her back, warm and steady. That night, supper was bread and stew, with wild onions Lena had dug from behind the barn. The children ate with the kind of joy that only comes when a home is no longer a question. Afterward, they lit the tin star lanterns again and hung them from the mantel. The barn remained open. Candles still burned in saucers atop barrels, but no one needed the space anymore. They'd moved inward. Before bed, Marta sat again on the porch, blanket around her shoulders. Harlan joined her with 2 cups of hot water steeped with dried lemon peel. I feel like I don't have to look behind me anymore, she said. You don't. A breeze moved across the land, rustling what remained of last season's weeds, brushing across the dirt where something sacred now slept under the cottonwood. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the ribbon Lena had given her. A simple thing, pressed tin on twine, but it caught the starlight like silver. I'll never be what I was before, she whispered. That's not what's needed, he replied. They sat until the stars deepened. The fire inside died to soft coals. The ranch, though still weather-worn and small, no longer echoed. It pulsed. Marta rested her head on Harlan's shoulder. I've never been this still. Me neither. He didn't say more. Neither did she. Somewhere between midnight and morning, before the rooster crowed and before breath fogged the window panes, the sun began to climb the ridge. Softly, like it too didn't want to disturb the beginning of a gentler story. And somewhere between midnight and morning, between what was and what could now be, the sun began to climb the ridge. Softly, like it too didn't want to disturb the beginning of a gentler story. The wind no longer howls through Creed's Hollow the way it used to, and maybe that's because something quieter took its place, like the hum of breath beside a warm hearth, or the soft creak of a rocking chair no longer empty, or the faint laughter of a child echoing through a once silent barn. And those are the sounds that stay in a place long after the snow melts and the strangers have become kin. For though the cottonwood still stands bare near the edge of the field, roots knotted deep with grief and memory, it no longer feels like a tree mourning the past, but like a witness to something that took root in its shadow and grew toward something warmer than spring. And that's how things tend to be in this part of the world. Slow to bloom, slow to forget, but not incapable of change. There's still the old quilt, faded at the corners, folded neatly over a chair whose wood has worn the shape of 2 shoulders, now instead of 1. And there's still a jar of plum jam on the shelf, placed there by a woman who never learned how to say sorry out loud, but tried anyway. and the barn lanterns still sway at night with tin stars punched by small, hopeful hands, and if you listen close, you might still hear the wind singing through the holes, catching on the shapes of stars made not of silver, but of patience, and will, and scraps of things nobody else wanted. There are wildflowers growing now in the far edge of the pasture, where once only frozen ground sat quiet beneath horse prints and mourning, and each bloom feels like a secret kept between the earth and those who learned how to listen. The porch rail still has a scratch from Jed's pocket knife, and the corner post still leans a bit from where Lena slammed the door too hard that first week, and Marta's apron still hangs on a nail by the back door, threadbare, clean, smelling of flour and wood smoke. Some things don't need to be polished to be holy. The truth is, no one really speaks of Corwin Slade anymore in town, and maybe that's for the best, because silence can be its own form of exile, and no one names the day he left or what he took with him. But the land remembers the way he turned dust to noise and never looked back, remembers how the children stood in a line, unshaking, unafraid, because sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest courage. The preacher still visits sometimes, and he never brings a sermon, just extra nails or a jar of pickled beans, and he says more with his hat in his hands than most do with pulpits, and when he looks at Harlan and Marta, he nods like a man who's seen a prayer answered in real time. You don't need a steeple to be sacred. You don't need lace to marry two lives. You just need stillness, and something to bury, and something to grow. Harlan still wears the same coat, and sometimes he turns the wedding band on his finger out of habit, but now he does it with a smile. Like touching the past doesn't mean staying in it. There are letters in the drawer, some from other women Marta knew, women who passed through towns like shadows and are now finding roots, writing back with words like, "I remember," and "thank you," and "I stayed." And those letters are folded soft and kept beneath the tin star necklace that Lena made. The mare still whinnies at dawn, and the gate still squeaks, and the soup still goes too thin when the flour runs out. But nobody complains anymore, because warmth isn't measured in thickness, but in who shares it. The truth doesn't need the whole world to believe it, just one man to stand beside it and say, "You're safe here." Justice may come late, but it still matters. Honor can be buried, but not erased. And sometimes, a forgotten woman is the one who saves an entire generation of kindness without ever meaning to, by stitching one torn hem, by refusing to flinch, by standing behind a child instead of in front of a lie. What began as refuge became something else entirely, a home made not of walls, but of choosing one another, again and again, even when it would have been easier to look away. So if you're still here, listening in the hush of evening, let that be your sign. Light a lantern, string a tin star, hold on to gentleness like it's the last match on a cold night. And if you were moved by this tale, if your heart still believes in quiet redemption and the long echo of dignity, let your voice be a small warmth in the dark. Tap the heart to say you're still with us. Subscribe to our channel if you want to be there when the next fire gets lit, the next story gets whispered, the next truth, forgotten by many but remembered by one, comes to life again beneath the cottonwood. This is the kind of story you don't close with a bang, but with breath, with a porch light left on, and with the belief that somewhere out west there's still room for the gentler ending.